Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's very kind of you, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Malvern. I mean, one of the problems with getting older is that you can remember that things have happened better than you can remember when they happened. I know I've been here before twice, and I think I've probably given a talk in this school before. I think both visits were for talks in schools, but it's a long time ago. So it's a real pleasure to be back. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the privilege of being the first speaker in this event. You listed, a modest number of challenges that human beings face, things like climate change, of course, dare I say it, pandemic, diseases, and so on. Some of the problems that we face are of our own making, so we have to consider the impact of human beings on the world and on the lives of other human beings. But wherever they came from, I mean, the fact is, the only way that we're going to solve them, if we are going to solve the big problems that we face, is through our own capacities, our intellectual abilities, by the functions of our minds and our cooperation, working together to solve problems. So human beings, in a way, the story of humanity is the story of the brains of human beings. It's a story of what can be generated by the contents of the skulls of the human beings who occupy this world. A pretty important issue. I'm going to talk about the past, the historical past of the human brain, the present, where we stand at the moment, and what we can learn from those facts about the brain, about the potential for the future of human brains and human intelligence. This, I think, is a good starting point because it really sets the scene for many of the questions I'm going to ask. It's a graph. Not every paleoanthropologist would agree with all of the distribution of points on this graph, but the overall picture is pretty clear. What it shows is the average volume of the brain, the capacity inside the skull, of different early hominid species over the past 3 million years or so. And it's very obvious there's been a big increase in the average size of the brain, and a progressive increase and an accelerating increase. And the arrow there marks the sort of division between pre-modern day human species and Homo sapiens. You'd have to qualify this now by saying that there was a period from probably about 300,000 years ago and perhaps 50,000 years ago, when there was more than one human species competing, certainly interbreeding, perhaps collaborating with each other on this planet. We're the only representatives left of Homo sapiens, but there were others. I'm going to talk about the reasons for that increase and the consequences of that increase in brain size, and to look critically at the obvious conclusion, which is that we are so important and effective and damaging in our impact on the world because of our big brains. It's the big brain that makes human beings special. I think that's a reasonable starting point for the discussion, but you'll see there are some qualifications to it. Now, having spent most of my working life in Oxford, I want to make a reference to Oxford, but make it for good reasons too. But I'm going to talk about this person, a great hero of mine and an incredibly important man. You might not recognise his name, but an incredibly important man in the history of British science, but particularly in the history of British neurology and the study of the brain, really. His name is Thomas Willis. He lived in Oxford. He went up to read theology, as almost everybody did, but the Civil War started around him and he changed his subject to medicine. He qualified in medicine in 2 years and became arguably the most important physician in Europe by the end of the Civil War. People used to flock to Oxford, to his hospital in Oxford, which still exists. It's now a Thai restaurant, I'm afraid to say. It's there. And he gained a great reputation. He was a terrific clinician. He gave the first descriptions of the symptoms of a number of now familiar diseases, everything from diabetes to schizophrenia. He was responsible for describing. But he was also a scientist. He was one of the founders of the Royal Society, along with Robert Hooke and all of the others, Christopher Wren and the others in Oxford at the time. So he was an experimentalist, or at least an observer of the natural world. And you can see that from his bench here, the fragments of stuff around. They're pieces of skulls. These are human skulls, no doubt about that. Opened up. He dissected. He studied the structure, and particularly the structure of the brains of criminals who'd been hung, but also of animals. He compared the human brain, the organisation of the human brain, to that of animals. And a lot of his writing is almost Darwinian in style, assuming that there must be some kind of continuity between animals and human beings. He wrote some remarkable books. But perhaps the most influential in neuroscience is a book called Cerebri Anatomy, The Structure of the Brain, which he published in 1664. The illustrations, and this is one of them from the book, are also really remarkable. He didn't draw them. The pictures in the book, which were the first really from life accurate pictures of brains, and in this case, quite obviously the human brain. This is a human brain. Viewed from underneath. They weren't drawn by Willis, they were drawn by one of his regular collaborators in his dissecting room, Christopher Wren. Wren was a great scientist. Wren was president of the Royal Society for a number of years. He held the chair of I think of geometry in Oxford at the time, and he'd held chairs of mathematics in London, and he was an experimental scientist as well as a theoretician, and he worked alongside Thomas Willis carrying out dissections. So what was he famous for? What were his contributions? Because you'll see there's a thread through my lecture which is dominated by him. Here are a couple of quotes. The cerebrum, that is the top part, the cerebral hemispheres, the big bit on top, wrinkly bit on top of the brain, is the primary seat of the rational soul. Well, through 17th century speak, what he means is cognition, cognitive function, thought, reasoning, perception. And he did use words like that, but his summary is the rational soul. And it is the cerebral cortex that he points to, the folded bit on the tops of our brains. And why? Because he saw very clearly that this distinctive feature of human brains compared with other animals was that part of the brain was enormously bigger. The human brain is just hugely bigger, particularly the structure of the cerebral hemispheres on the top. He was the first person really to point that out very clearly. But more than that, then to compare what human beings could do with what animals could do, and to attribute the difference to the difference in the size and organisation of the brain. So he said, the various acts of imagination and memory, and again, I'm interpreting from everything else that he wrote, that by imagination he really means perception, thought, rational thinking, planning, and all of those things. Those various acts ought to be moved, carried out, within certain and distinctly limited or bounded places. So he was saying that the different aspects of our mental life, whether it's memory or thinking or seeing or hearing or whatever, are done in different bits of the brain. And again, that was revolutionary, and it became an absolutely dominant theme, as you'll see, in brain research. Different bits of our brain do different things. The brain isn't a kind of unitary, homogeneous mass. It has these dedicated, well, in computer terms, it all microprocessors, if you like, scattered all over it, doing their own thing, somehow cooperating with each other. But basically, it's a sort of multi-purpose, multi-component computing organ, and it was Willis who first suggested that. So localization of function, it was a really important concept, although it did go a little bit awry, and actually the second clear statement of that function didn't occur until 200 years or more later, at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was a bit of a diversion because it was entirely wrong. Actually, it even set back the commitment to the idea of localized function. And it was the fault, the responsibility of this guy, Austrian anatomist and psychiatrist and neurologist, Franz Josef Gall. He was the originator of what came to be known as phrenology. The idea that, yes, different functions took place in different parts of the brain, but more than that, you could actually diagnose the abilities, the mental capacities and character of a person by feeling the bumps on the head, which he argued corresponded to enlargements in certain parts of the brain. Right? So this is a well-known summary of the ideas of the phrenologists. But there are several things about this that are interesting. First of all, you'll notice that the divisions, the areas, are really very, very neat, and that they are laid out on the skull, on the scalp of the head, even though the shape of the brain doesn't follow the contours of the scalp at all points. There are sinuses and so on. The brain is really very different in its shape from the skull, but he imagined that those properties were somehow referred up to the surface of the skull. And look at the kinds of things that he suggested might be localized, things like sublimity and ideality, cautiousness. There were slight variations on this in the United States, and there was one for republicanism. Very, very large in certain well-known politicians, I think. Anyway, these are interesting ideas which held sway for a long time. They were very popular in social circles, non-medical circles. They pretty rapidly ran out of favour amongst scientists and neurologists. But there was, for instance, a phrenological society in Philadelphia until the 1950s. Now, interestingly, if you compare the head of Gall, you see, Gall's got a very interesting bump just here, which corresponds to the organ of self-esteem. He was a very opinionated guy. There's an area down here called amativeness, which was attributed to one cocktail party that he went to, where he somehow had the opportunity to feel behind the ear of a lady guest and discovered she had an interesting protuberance here. And as a consequence of that one observation, a new organ of amativeness was invented. That's a bit of a sidetrack to the growing and very solid evidence that functions are localized. I mean, we know it most obviously from the fact that when someone suffers from a brain injury or a stroke, the whole of their mental life might be degraded to some extent, but there are very specific effects, like not being able to move one hand or not being able to speak and so on, whereas other parts of function carry on pretty normally. Okay. Let me just tell you some facts about the brain to get the scale of this into your mind. There are approximately 100 billion nerve cells in human brain, 10 to the 11. So that's a very big number, but it's trivial compared with the number of connections between them, because every one of those nerve cells, on average, has about 10,000 connections from other nerve cells, massively interconnected. So that means that there are 10 to the 15 altogether, which is enormous. I mean, it's larger. 10 to the 11 is already as large as the number of known stars in our galaxy. So 10 to 15 is a simply massive number. It's inside the head of every one of you. If you do the sums, the average, if you do the sums in log units, the average human lifespan is 10 to the 9 seconds. It's a bit frightening when you hear your life expressed in seconds, but that's what it is on average. Working out, it's about 70 or 80 or something. So if you have 10 to the 15, one with 15 noughts, connections in your head, and you live for 10 to the 9 seconds, it means that on average through your life, you are generating 1 million connections in your brain. for each second you live. Now, an awful lot of that is done when you're young, obviously, but it goes, we now know, it goes on throughout life. Connections are being formed all the time. They can be changed by disease, that's certainly the case. Connections can be lost in degenerative brain diseases like Alzheimer's. They can respond to damage, so the brain can accelerate its production of new connections. That is happening constantly throughout life. And we'll see some of the consequences of that later. Okay. Now, here are some very relevant facts when we think about the evolution of our brains, this huge expansion of our brains 250,000 years ago. The brain is the most metabolically hungry organ in the body. The brain consumes 20% or so of the oxygen and the glucose which is circulating in your body. And frankly, the story of biology, or at least the story of animal biology, is largely about a struggle for energy. Can you get enough food? Can you convert it efficiently? Can you organise your life so that you don't use too much energy? Because energy is the bottom line for animals in general. And you can see how that principle is threaded through evolution, keeping bodies as compactly organised as possible. You can see the trade-off between the efficiency of animals in getting food compared with their survival, their capacity for survival. Yet here we are carrying around this enormously metabolically demanding organ. And the obvious explanation for that in crude terms is that there must have been a trade-off between the brain needing food and getting food. The ability of our brains to help us to get energy must somehow have compensated or continues to compensate for the demands of the brain for that energy. The brain is subdivided into different functions, and just to give you one example, because I'm personal interest in this, vision, I worked mainly on vision in my own research, and in your brains about 20 billion nerve cells are devoted to analysing the information coming from your eyes. So what feels like a completely effortless function, just opening your eyes and seeing the world, turns out to be an immense computational task if you judge it by that, by how much of our brains are devoted to doing it. And that's an interesting point because it's a good example of the fact that our own introspections about how we work, how our minds work, and particularly about what's difficult and demanding intellectually, doesn't correlate with the magnitude of the task involved. Vision feels easy, it's fantastically difficult. Things like mathematics and playing chess feel difficult, but actually in terms of computing power, the size of the areas the brain occupies is probably very simple. It's just that not everybody does them well. And we all do vision, if we're normally working brains do vision incredibly well. Okay. So it takes about 4% of the food we eat. Seeing, opening your eyes, looking around takes about 4% of what you eat. All right, back to evolution. So what was needed, if we think about this, what was needed to produce that big increase in brain size? And why didn't it happen in other species? I mean, yes, all right, there are other species that have big brains. Elephants have big brains. Whales have big brains. But the special size of the brains of those very large animals is, to a large extent, accounted for by the fact that they are large. There's a correlation between brain size and body size because, a big body has a bigger surface area of sense organs going into the brain. It has far more musculature to control, so you just need more brain to run it. So there is a relationship between brain size and body size, which to a considerable extent explains the very large sizes of elephant and whale brains. Human beings are just off scale on that general function. We have much bigger brains than fit with the general relationship between brain size and body size. Okay, so Darwin. Let's ask Darwin what was needed for this to happen, the increase in brain size. And of course we go back to the principle of Darwinism. In the struggle for survival, the fittest win out at the expense of their rivals because they succeed in adapting themselves best to their environment. So if you see some interesting evolutionary change, like the emergence of the big brain, you have to ask these questions. Well, how did it happen? How did an inherited factor, because that's what Darwin was talking about, inheritance, of course, cause the big increase in brain size, and why was that increase valuable in helping early human beings to adapt themselves better to their environment? Hang on to that phrase, because it becomes very important a little later. So let's just go through the steps. Well, the first thing is there has to be something that happened genetically to the DNA of hominids that was tending to make the brains of their offspring get bigger. So there has to be a genetic mechanism for controlling the size of the brain. And you might think, that's really tricky. How on earth? There's a gene, maybe a single gene, mutating, change the size of a complicated organ like the brain. It turns out to be very easy. So for instance, I'll give you one example. It's just one example of a number of genetic changes in mice that can dramatically alter, and particularly dramatically expand, the size of the mouse brain. This is a microscopic section in that plane there, the coronal plane, through the brain of a mouse. Now, if you know anything about a mouse brain, you'll know that there's something very, very odd about this picture. And that is the folded structure. The surface is deeply folded. And that doesn't happen in the normal mouse. The brain is flat. So this is a hugely bigger surface area than a normal mouse. In fact, it looks a lot like a human brain. The human brain looks like this. It's all folded up and wrinkled. And the reason is there's such a lot of it, of the surface. It has to be wrinkled to fit in to the space available. This mouse is the same. And the reason is one mutation in one gene. So what does this particular gene do? There are other genes that have the same effect, but this one simply controls how many cycles of cell division the stem cells that are making the embryo go through before they stop dividing. And that obviously determines the size. So big animals go through a lot of cycles of division, small animals, not many. And in this case, the changes are specific in the brain, and it makes the brain get very much bigger, just for the cells to go on cycling a bit longer. So actually, in terms of genetic regulation, mutational change, making a big brain is incredibly easy. So the obvious question is, well, why hasn't it happened to other lines in vertebrate evolution? Why don't we have, mice with huge brains? Why don't we have cats and dogs with massive brains, highly intelligent? And the answer is energy. What keeps it under control is the fact that making a big brain is easy, but it's a disaster because it just generates offspring that are going to consume more and more energy than they can gather for themselves. So there's a huge factor which is working against expansion of the brain. We've broken free of it somehow. Okay. What's the next thing? Regulation of brain size might have been easy. But there then has to be a very clever mechanism for reorganizing. It's not just a matter of throwing in new nerve cells, just making the brain bigger. You've got to make sure that adding that new stuff is useful. So there have to be inbuilt general rules that allow brains to deal with the presence of lots of additional nerve cells that happen to be there by chance because of a mutation. And it turns out that during the development of the normal brain, there are all kinds of processes that enable nerve cells to connect together in a very adaptive way, just dealing with the normal fact that numbers of cells vary from individual to individual, they vary in different structures within the network. It's got to be an adaptive process. Normal development has to be capable of dealing with differences of numbers between one individual and another, so evolution could have played into that, taking advantage of natural mechanisms whereby brains wire themselves up. So if we look at how brains have evolved in general, it's a very interesting fact emerges. What this is a kind of summary of the whole of vertebrate evolution, really. If we go back to, say, this point here, to the insectivores, this is the appearance of placental mammals. After the dinosaurs have gone, this enormous expansion of the mammals, and the huge success of mammals, peaking, might say, in the dominance of human beings. So here human beings are at the top. So these are the major lines within vertebrate evolution. And here are little pictures of brains. And this is derived from experimental work in which the brain has been mapped out in different species. So if we look at the hedgehog, for instance, which is representative of the very early insectivore mammals, and look at the way in which the brain's organised, you can see this is looking at a side view of the brain, comparable to this picture of a human brain up here. The coloured areas, the red, the blue, the green, well, you can see what they're for here. The orange and red areas are for touch and somatic sensation, information coming from the body into the brain. The green area here, down here in the hedgehog, here in human beings is an auditory area for hearing. And then the visual area is at the back in the hedgehog, the blue area here, and so it is in human beings. So the basic array layout of these modules dealing with our senses is the same through the whole of vertebrate evolution. But look at the hedgehog brain. There's nothing else. There's virtually nothing else except these little areas that are committed to the sense organs. Whereas in human beings, which have the same basic arrangement of sense organs, there's all this massive stuff that's been added. So stuff has been added in between these areas which are clearly very firmly committed right from the start of vertebrate evolution. And it's the bits in between them that are really interesting because they've been added by evolution, and presumably they've given each species in the steppe something extra. All right. Well, if we ask what are these areas for? What do they do? The answer at one level is really a bit boring, because it turns out that most of them are also dealing with information from the sense organs. And this starts to get at the reason why 4% of what you eat is vision. There's billions of neurons. They've been added during evolution in the form of new processing modules being added into the cortex of animals. So here, this is a picture of the monkey brain. This is the back of the brain, this is the front of the brain. And all these coloured regions show regions that are concerned with vision, that are processing information from the eyes, but they're doing different sorts of jobs, all contributing in different ways to the understanding of vision. The red area at the back is the primary area, the same as in the hedgehog, and these other areas have these many, probably 25 to 30 in a monkey, have been added between hedgehogs and monkeys. And in human beings, there are even more. So about a quarter of the entire surface of your human brain, is committed to vision, and most of it has been added during vertebrate evolution. So you say, well, what's the point? You've got one area that's doing vision, what are all these other processing modules doing? And a lot has been learnt from the studies of monkeys. The reason why you can see these different areas and different colours is because people know what the functions of those areas are by recording from nerve cells in those regions in monkeys. But we now know through being able to correlate those studies with brain scanning studies in humans that the same kind of organisation applies. This is an MRI machine. It happens to be in the Oxford Imaging Centre. And here are a couple of this is now a very eminent American neurologist who did his doctorate with me, and here a postdoc who was in the lab a few years ago working on this scanner. All right, so what can you learn from scanners? I mean, it'd be nice to think that we had methods that could tell us about the function of every nerve cell and how they're connected in human beings. That does not exist. So the techniques are a bit crude in scale, and certainly for brain scanning very limited in the ability to detect change over time, but extremely useful in telling us where things are happening and basically what sorts of processing is going on. Let me just show you an example. You put someone in the scanner, they lie in the scanner and look at a television screen. And you put on the television screen a lot of static dots, black or white dots. So they're clearly visible visual contrast present, but they're not moving. You turn that on and you compare it. You look at what the brain does in response, the change of blood flow in the brain, and you ask what part of the brain becomes active when the dots appear compared with just a uniform grey screen. And here it is. This is a slice through the brain, horizontal slice. This is the back down here, the back of the brain, that's the front of the brain. And the red indicates regions in which there's been a surge of blood flow. In other words, where the nerve cells are active. And lo and behold, it's right at the back of the brain, the region that the hedgehog has, that responds to vision, that has direct connections from the eyes. But we know from the studies in the monkeys that all the area in front of that is also full of nerve cells that will respond to visual stimulation, but not to static dots on the screen. So, let's do something very simple, just change it, make the dots move. So here are the same dots, but they're just moving. And now, if we compare the response of the brain to this, the moving pattern, and this, and we subtract that response from whatever this causes, we can see the activity in the brain caused by the movement alone. And here it is. Quite different picture, different region further forward, just above the ears there. Definitely not present in hedgehogs. It's been added by evolution. And it's devoted to the analysis of movement, and very sophisticated analysis of movement, helping to detect the form of moving objects and analyse what moving objects are as opposed to static ones. Here's another nice view of the same area, projected onto the surface of the brain on the left-hand side here, the right-hand side here. It's a little tiny area which is absolutely committed to detecting movement. Just another example, and this is from work from my lab. If you put people into the scanner and project onto the screen photographs of people, faces, profile or full face, 10 seconds each, but they're randomly mixed with photographs of manufactured objects, vases, microscopes, you can see, cups and saucers or whatever, and it's a completely random sequence of photographs the person's looking at. But you now just ask the computer at the end of that series of exposures, tell me the parts of the brain that were more activated by the faces than the objects, and the parts that were more activated by the objects than the faces. And here's the answer. This is a slice through lower down in the brain now. And you see two regions, quite small regions, a centimetre across, something like that. The orange one responded much more to the face images than the objects, and the blue one more to the objects than the faces. Actually, this was a preliminary experiment for a more interesting phase, in which the people who'd gone through this initial test were shown that the famous vase face illusion, yes, that looks like two faces or a vase, and it just flips backwards and forwards. You know what I mean? And we asked them to push a button when it changed into faces, and then a button when it changed into vases, and we looked at what was happening in these regions, and you could see the activity going up and down exactly correlated with their perception. So you can begin, at least at that kind of crude level, to read out what people are perceiving and understanding about the world, even when the physical world is constant. Okay. All right, so we begin to see a little bit about how things might have been reorganised to accommodate the new bits and how those new bits might have been used. But the third crucial step for Darwin is this. There has to be an advantage to the particular individual that comes directly as a result of the chain of the mutation. And it has to be an advantage straight away, or they'll get knocked off and they won't survive, and others with different mutations will. So Darwinism depends on there being an advantage straight away for whatever new mutational change has occurred. Animals occupy what the biologists would call niches, opportunities within the environment, by mutating into them, producing a development which enables them to survive better than others without the mutation. So the big brain had to be helpful straight away. Okay. Let's step back just a second. I mean, we've assumed that big brains give an advantage. But in fact, animals with incredibly small brains can show traits that we would think of as being very clever. I mean, they're surprising. And the more that's done on comparative animal behaviour, the more we see examples of animals doing things that we used to think were uniquely human and require a lot of intelligence and planning and forethought and so on. I'll just give you one example from a very big literature on clever behaviour in small animals. And it centres on this, on Aesop's famous fable of the crow and the pitcher, you remember, where the crow comes along, it's very thirsty, finds a pitcher full of water, but it can't get its bill down into the jug deep enough to be able to drink the water. So what it does is to pick up stones and drop them in and raise the level of the water. Very clever. Well, it turns out that crows can do that. Here's a wonderful experiment done by Nathan Emery a few years ago, in which he had naive crows that hadn't been trained to do this, and he simply allowed them access to a cylinder with a bit of water in it and a pile of stones. And they weren't particularly thirsty, but they did like mealworms, and there were mealworms floating on the surface of the water. And they couldn't get it, they could see them, they wanted them, they couldn't get their bill in, and they very quickly started picking up stones and dropping them in. So what you see here is a summary. This is for one animal, and these are a number of successive sessions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The bird was left there for a while, and then taken away and put back again with a new cylinder. And you could see the sequence of stones, how many it took before the water level was raised, and the size of the stones. There were two sizes of stones, big ones and small ones. The big ones are shown by dark symbols, right? So to begin with the first trial, he puts in 5 or 6 stones, a mixture. After a little while, he was putting in a small number of large stones. He very quickly learned that the large ones were better. And this is amazing. It's fantastically clever. And there are myriad examples of this kind of very clever, focused, clever behaviour by animals, particularly birds, actually. Yes, but I suppose you'd say that's fine, that's a specialised application of intelligence. But human beings aren't like that, are they? They have much more generalised capacities. Here we are, this is a standard dogma. We have a very special ability to be able to consider the past, to reflect about the future, to plan on the basis of our past experience. Another thing that's very important, and most developmental psychologists put more and more emphasis on this, it's the capacity to collaborate. And human beings have, at least a lot of the time, been rather successful as a result of collaborating. Division of labour, division of responsibility, sharing intellectual ability as well as manual ability. So we can communicate, which is important for collaboration, we cooperate, we can understand each other's minds. Again, sometimes. Right, let me just show a little scenario. I think this is a lovely experiment, because it really, it's a bit of hand-waving, but it might show you what happened progressively during evolution, and therefore what was captured by that process in the human brain. This is a result of a brain scanning experiment. So we're looking at the side of the human brain here. And again, people just went into a scanner, and there were 3 separate things that were shown to them. And those 3 things produced selective activation of the brain in these 3 regions. This blue region, the green region, and the purple region. The yellow is it's not a separate one, it's just overlap between the green and the purple. So there are 3 separate stimuli that were shown. And you can see as it happens, these areas lie in a sort of sequence. And they lie in a sequence between the visual part of the brain at the back and the tactile part of the brain further forward. So maybe this happened, these were added progressively during evolution. Keep that as a possibility in mind. All right, what were the 3 stimuli? Well, here we are. First of all, we know that the back of the brain, the main visual area, responds even to static patterns, right? And we also know from that example I've just shown you before that the region in front of it responds to movement. And certainly part of this bit here, of this blue complex, is the area that I showed before, MT, that's selectively devoted to movement. The green area is really interesting, because that also, the stimulus that was shown to produce that activity in the brain was also just moving dots. But the dots were moving in a very particular way. It's called biological motion, and you don't have to look at it for very long to see what you see. You see a human form. But it's being conveyed, this is computer generated, it's being conveyed completely by the relative movement of those points which represent the articulation points of the limbs. We are able to understand that and compute it into an understanding of what that thing is. It's a person, it's animate, moving around. And you can see that that could be very advantageous for an animal to be able to see that when something's moving in the world, it's not just that it's moving, it's not a tree falling down or a rock dropping or something, it is an animal, it's another animal. It's a very important skill. And there it is, represented specifically by a big chunk of brain, which has probably been added during the evolution of this sequence. Okay, so this looks like a kind of sequence of development of more sophistication in understanding what movement means. So what's the purple bit? Anyone want to hazard a guess at what the stimulus was that generated activity in that region, in the next region along? Well, of a sort, yeah. You'll see in a second.
Something approaching you.
That you'd see certainly in the biological motion area.
3D image.
Sorry?
3-dimensional.
Three-dimensional. That's interesting. All of these areas actually respond to three-dimensional form. Movement and three-dimensionality are very much tied together, but not specifically in that region. Sorry? Food. Well, that's good if you're following my argument, I guess. Let me put you out of your agony. It is verbs. Written verbs displayed on the screen and action verbs. Hit, run, whatever. Verbs of action, verbs of movement, verbs of action. Either written or spoken. They activate that region. And, you sort of see a sequence there. It's gradually analysing through visual information about movement into this sort of symbolic representation of movements and actions in the symbolism of language. Okay, hang on to language, because again, I'm getting there soon, because language becomes important in a second. All right, so we're sort of saying the brain's got bigger, that's easy genetically. They organised themselves because of the capacity of the brain just to make use of extra bits. And they're useful, having a big brain is useful. But there's a problem. It's a huge problem, and it's expressed very clearly here in a book written by a good friend of mine, Stephen Oppenheimer, who's a geneticist, very much involved in studying the genetics of early human beings and how they migrated. And he says in this book, the idea that we somehow grew a big brain first and then decided what it was for is a negation of the principles of natural selection. New kinds of behaviour precede the physical adaptation that evolves to better exploit that behaviour. This is Darwinism. Mutation requires an opportunity in order for it to be preserved. So having that big brain, in these terms, classic Darwinism, the big brain must have immediately given a huge advantage to early human beings. But everything that we know about, and we don't know that much, but everything we do know about the early lifestyle of Stone Age human beings 250,000 years ago is indistinguishable from that of present-day chimpanzees. They lived in groups of maybe 10 to 20 individuals. There's a kind of male-dominated hierarchy. They foraged for food locally. There was some communal sharing of offspring and so on. There were hunting parties that went out collaboratively to hunt for prey, for other species, or waged war on other groups of chimpanzees. And that's probably how early humans lived. There's no evidence of a massive and sudden application of intellect on the world. So it's hard to explain. Even harder is this. This is from the same book, and it's an illustration. And what it shows is it's a logarithmic scale, so it looks different. But this is the increase in brain size over, 2 million years or so along here. Here it is. These are different samples with the Homo sapiens up here. And this strange dotted line way down here is called technical cultural innovation. However you measure that in log units, I'm not quite sure, but it's certainly very, very slow before it increases compared with the increase in brain size. And it's accelerating hugely in the last few thousand years, from reading to computers, basically. So why is this detached? And can you really say that this hasn't been advantageous to human beings? All of the increase in knowledge and science and stuff we've been doing in the last few thousand years, which cannot have anything to do, almost certainly has nothing to do, with the mutations 250,000 years ago that generated human beings. So the important events, if a Stone Age human being, had a shave and dressed in a decent suit and walked in through the door here, you would not turn a hair. They'd be, in every important respect, the same as present-day people. And no reason to believe that their brains on average were slightly bigger than ours. So no reason to believe that they would not be capable of the things that we do. But we are doing so much more now than then, none of which can be accounted for by genetic change. So this is not Darwinism. This aspect of human biology, perhaps the most important aspect of human biology, is not Darwinist. But what is it? Back to Thomas Willis. Because the other absolutely revolutionary thing that Willis said is this. It's just one phrase in the book. But he says, first of all, he says, these folds, and he's talking about the folds of the brain, or rollings about, as he says, are far more and greater in a man than any living creature. It's just bigger and more folded. To wit, for the various and manifold actions of superior faculties. The more cleverer you are, the more folds you have. That's basically what he's saying. But they are garnished, these folds are garnished with an uncertain, as it were, fortuitous series. What he's saying is that if you look in detail at different brains of different people, there are small differences. And it's true. There's great similarity. There are individual little differences in the way in which the folds of the brain are made up. So why? He said that the exercises of the animal function, animal here means, from the Latin anima meaning mind, the functions of the mind might be free and changeable. So he's basically saying that the more that a bit of brain is used for a particular mental function, the more it will grow. And that accounts for the differences between individual people. That's incredibly revolutionary. I think no one followed up on that until maybe 50 years ago, when the evidence that brains can change, and actually can even grow to some extent, as you'll see, minimally, as a result of activating particular mental functions, as that evidence grew. So here we are. I should just describe one experiment, and it's from my own lab, to show just how much the brain, even the adult brain, can reorganize. So this is an MRI experiment, and let me try and take you through it. First of all, here are visual stimuli shown to people in the scanner. And you've seen this experiment. This is looking at moving dots. And what we're looking at below is which parts of the brain are activated by that stimulus. And here it is. This is the motion area. Okay? And if you look at faces, that's the area that we saw before on the right-hand side of the brain, the fusiform face area, as it's called, which normally responds when you look at faces. Now, we then, having looked at that arrangement in normal sighted people, looked in people who'd been blind since typically 3 or 4 years of age for at least 2 decades, to see whether there was any hint of the visual parts of the brain being used and taken over for other functions. And for someone who's blind, a third of the brain no longer has its normal job to do because there isn't information coming from the eyes. So you might reasonably ask, is the brain capable of using that computing power? And I think in some circumstances at least it is. So here's the experiment. Of course, the blind people don't respond to visual stimuli, so there's no response in the brain if you show a blind person a visual stimulus. But if you touch the skin of the hands of a blind person, then they certainly feel that, and so do sighted people as well, of course. So now, you can look at the responses to touch stimuli. And this isn't tactile emotion, as I just said, this is tactile motion. It's movement across the surface of the skin. And this is touching faces. The faces that are being touched are dolls' heads. So the person's lying in the scanner with their arms outside the scanner, and an object is put onto their hand. And it can either be just an amorphous object that they can't feel any particular shape of, which is moved around over the hand, or a doll's head, which immediately feels like a face in your hand, whether you're blind or sighted. So you can now say, is there any part of the brain which is selectively activated by touching a face? Is there any part of the brain that's activated selectively by an object moving on your skin? And the answer is, in sighted people, there isn't. There's no particular region of the brain, localized region, which is devoted to those things. But if you look at a person who's blind and has become blind late in life, the moving skin touch activates the same part of the brain that's activated by looking at moving stimuli in a sighted person. So the motion area has been taken over by touch. And equally, touching the doll's head activates the same region in the fusiform gyrus, the visual face area. It's as if the brain can borrow the computation that's normally used for vision and apply it to touch. And it's just remarkable. How on earth is that achieved? These areas of the brain are centimetres apart. How do they communicate? How does one part of the brain tell the other part of the brain, I'd like to use your computing power, please? I mean, it's just amazing. And I can't give you answers to those things, but it happens. Okay, 2 minutes about the future. Because, of course, by definition, we know less about the future than the past and present. What we've learnt is that something has been happening in our brains since human beings were created, which gives us a very different brain ability compared with before. That raises all kinds of questions about how early human beings dealt with the fact that they had inherited this hungry organ, which actually wasn't doing that much different early on. That's a different question, maybe we can talk about that. For the future, let me just give you one quick story. And it refers back to language. Language, many people, Chomsky, Lincoln and so on, have argued that human beings are distinct because they are predestined, predetermined, innately set up to do spoken language, that we are speaking animals. That's what makes us distinctive. And you can create a whole lot of argument that our brains are indeed innately pre-specified to do language. And there's a hardwired connectivity in our brains, left side of the brain, for doing it. Here's a classic neurology textbook picture of this region here at the back, the temporal lobe, near the auditory areas, Wernicke's area, which is supposed to be concerned with taking in spoken speech and interpreting it and understanding it. Then a great bundle of fibres, the arcuate fasciculus, connecting to Broca's area in the frontal lobe, which is responsible for generating grammar and enabling you to speak. So the constant interflow. And those things are there and they're built in. If they're damaged, they produce very specific defects or different sorts of aphasias. Well, where did that come from? If it's innate, what was the precedent? How did it develop? Did it all just suddenly develop through individual mutations? That's very hard to understand. And one of the big puzzles is what the previous background to human language could have been in other species. Well, there's a lot of interest in the possibility that our spoken language might have built on the ability of earlier primate species to communicate by gestures, by moving their limbs and their bodies in ways that had symbolic representation. I just want to show you a clip of a movie from a group at St Andrews who've been painstakingly classifying the use of specific gestures in the wild, in chimpanzees, just observing them. Of course, there are lots of movements, but they've noticed that many of them recur frequently, and they recur in particular social contexts. So they really do look like specific gestures that all of the chimpanzees recognize and that are used to communicate. Just show you one clip that illustrates 3 different movements that are used to try to attract the attention of another chimpanzee and to call them over to come to you. But let me pose a question then. That's all about spoken language. But if anything has accelerated human intellectual abilities and the use of our brains, it is the development of reading and writing. Being able to preserve information on a page, convey it to other people, but not by telling them, by giving a piece of paper, putting it on a computer disk or whatever. I mean, the changes since we developed reading and writing have been, that's the reason for that incredible increase in cultural evolution. Right, so what about it? All human groups are capable of learning to read and write. And what I'm doing is listing for reading and writing exactly the arguments that are being used to claim that spoken language must be innate and genetic. But I'm doing it for reading and writing. So all human beings are capable, as far as we know, of learning to read and write, all human groups, not every individual. They're learnt very quickly and in ordered stages, at a very particular stage in early development. There's a particular sensitive period early in life for learning to read. If you don't learn to read by the age of 10, 15, it's much more difficult later on. There are genetic, inherited dyslexias. There are difficulties in reading which are heritable, so they're associated with genes. Again, a strong argument for something genetic going on here. And there are specific brain regions, as you'll see in 1 second, devoted to the task of reading, in the same place in every person who has learnt to read. And brain damage can produce particular forms of dyslexia, reading inability. All of this sounds just like the arguments for the genetic basis of spoken language, but we know that reading cannot be genetically determined. We've only been doing it for a few thousand years, and the basic genetic makeup of human beings was fixed 250,000 years ago. We've invented it. We invented reading, but it has produced all the changes in brain organisation that we associate with spoken language. And that leads me, anyway, to ask deep questions about whether spoken language is really innate. Anyway, so here we are. We know the origins of reading and writing, ideographic symbols, pictorial symbols, but then transformed into some kind of grammatical representation. And here's the really interesting point. This is the work of a good friend of mine, Stanislas Dehaene in Paris, who has discovered that reading words activates a very particular part of the left hemisphere of your brain. The language is on the left side. But only if you learn to read. So it's not just sitting there waiting for reading. How could it be? It develops as a consequence of learning to read, but always in the same place. And if it's damaged, there are difficulties in reading. So it's a solid part of brain organisation. Here's the experiment, and he's comparing 6-year-old readers, kids who've learned to read, with 6-year-old kids who haven't yet learned to read. And he's showing them various things, geometrical patterns and faces, houses, and words, written words. And here the green area on the left side responds specifically when the reading kids listen to words. Look at written words. This is looking at written words, looking at pictures of faces or houses. In the 6-year-old non-readers who haven't learned to read, looking at words doesn't activate any part of the brain specifically. And if you look at 9-year-olds, looking at dyslexic children who haven't been able to learn to read, They don't have a specific area, whereas the 9-year-old readers have that area very clear. The brain builds its own dedicated new area on the basis of learning to read, just as reliably as it has areas responsible for spoken language. Okay. And remarkable, I won't dwell on a remarkable experiment recently, looking at the structure of the spoken language connections that arcuate fasciculus joining together Wernicke's area and Broca's area. They looked at the complexity of the structure using brain scanning and showed that the complexity and thickness and number of fibres in the spoken language pathway depended on the complexity of the linguistic environment that the child was growing up in. They measured the content, the grammatical complexity, sophistication of the words that were being used, the language around the child, and found that it was correlated with the numbers of fibres and complexity of the spoken pathways. Again, I mean, potentially this is evidence that the spoken language system is also being built as a consequence of speaking and listening to speech. Not just language, here's one of the myriad examples of the way in which our brains can be very rapidly changed by what we think about and do. The experiment from a group in Oxford, and what they're doing is measuring, this isn't activity, this isn't functional imaging, it's structural imaging. They're looking at the thickness of the grey matter of the brain in children who have been playing computer games for the first time. Over the course of a week, they're given a few minutes each day to learn Tetris, one of the early simple computer games. And they hadn't played computer games before. By the way, this was done a few years ago. It would be impossible to find 13-year-olds who hadn't played. They found a group of 13-year-olds who hadn't played computer games, gave them computer games for a few minutes each day for a week, and then found that all of the areas here that are shown in red or yellow had changed the thickness of the grey matter significantly as a result of doing that. I mean, Thomas Willis was right. If you exercise your faculties, the brain can change very dramatically and quickly change its organisation, whether it's learning to read or it's learning to play computer games. Okay, so what does this mean about the future? Well, we know that every human brain is engineered, to some extent at least, by its own experience. And that our abilities, our cognitive capacity is largely the result of cultural inheritance, learning from others, rather than the genes that we got 250,000 years ago. There is no reason to believe that process is over. In fact, if anything, it continues to accelerate. The change in brain ability as a result of learning from others and modifying our own brains. I mean, there's a downside to this, and it means that what we do is dependent so much on what we have learned that if we lost that bedrock of knowledge and the ability to pass it on, if libraries were lost or universities were lost, schools stopped functioning even for a generation, we will be back in the Stone Age. Because the information has to be held and passed from person to person, generation to generation, in order to preserve what we have created cognitively between us. So, are we making new areas? Are we potentially doing what happened in Sumeria 5,000 years ago? Are we creating new brain modules because of discovering new things that we can do with our brains, sharing that knowledge, instructing others on it? Well, I now live and work in Hong Kong, where the issue of use of personal computing devices is even more advanced than it is here. I just took this picture in the cafeteria at the university where I work, and it didn't occur to me until after I'd taken it that there is not a single person, except maybe this girl who's carrying a tray, there's not a single person who is not looking at their phone while they're eating, even if they're surrounded by their friends, whatever. And okay, people are obsessed with the coronavirus now, but not as much as they're obsessed with their phone. Are we building a phone interpretation area in our brains? Is it different from the word area? Certainly our brains have the capacity to do it. What we do with the computing power of our own brains is up to us to decide. We have to make the kinds of decisions that the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, whatever, were making when they invented written words and reading. We have the capacity to decide what we want to make of our brains. It depends very much on how we teach our children, how we organise that teaching, and how we do it in a way which would be most effective and valuable in changing, stepping up the intellectual gear, if you like, of future generations in a valuable way. Okay, thank you.